And a basketball.
Mention of basketball.
I think we need to change that clock.
To what? Oh my gosh. No, it's 6:30.
I think it's right. No, look.
Steve Jobs time.
Hi, Judy. I always feel close to you. But that was kind of creepy, so. This chair's winding me up.
All right, we're all getting a little punchy here. I'd like to call the meeting to order. This is the special meeting, actually, of the November Planning Commission. So we normally start by looking at our action summary from the previous meeting. Has anybody had a chance to look over our minutes? And I would take a motion to accept.
Move to approve and accept the minutes.
Thank you. Do we have a second?
Second.
Okay, we have 2 seconds.
Oh boy.
Take Commissioner Struck all in favor? And it passes. We have 10-0. Do we have any committee reports from that have met over the past month?
Yes,
Okay.
downtown master plan. We did a little activity where we sort of identified the most pressing issues for downtown, and I can't remember what the number one issue was, but we discussed the balance of progress and keeping sort of the feel of downtown and the historic resources, and discussed things we would like to see happen there. So we discussed transportation, retaining businesses, several other things. Kind of got to know what's going on, the community happenings, community events, and apparently we'll be meeting 3 times, and that's basically it, and kind of the scope of the project. So.
Okay. Any other committee reports? Do we have any written communications from the public that didn't make it into the packet? Everything got in under the wire? Do we have any written communications from staff, from planning commissioners or other commissioners?
No.
Do we have any written action of waiver requests or determinations by the city engineer?
No, ma'am.
All right. Disclosure of ex parte communications. This is the time when we mention any discussions that we've had about any items on our agenda, so that everyone can be on the same page for how we have that discussion. That's more important when we have quasi-judicial items, but this is a legislative item that we'll be tackling today with the comprehensive plan. And so we're going to ask each of the planning commissioners to mention names and groups of people they may have talked with, but if we were to discuss everything that we'd had in those conversations, we may be here yet all night. So I will start with my ex parte communications about the comprehensive plan. And I've met with the following groups about rural issues: Clint Hornberger, Willow Springs Township Clerk, the Willow Springs Fire Department, American Farmland Trust, Helen Schnoes with the Douglas County Sustainability Office, Tanya Voigt, Douglas County Zoning and Codes. And about environmental issues, I've met with Frank Norman from the Kansas Alliance for Wetlands and Streams and the Upper Wakarusa Raps, Kim Bellamere from the Grassland Heritage Foundation, Jennifer Delisle and Kelly Kincher from the Kansas Biological Survey, Penny Van Auken, former planning commissioner, Thad Holcomb from the Water Action Committee, and Don Bueller from the Friends of the Caw. Any others? Ex parte communications, conversations you've had about the comprehensive plan in the community.
No, mine are limited to Penny Van Auken and Thad Holcomb.
So I've had a few. I don't think I'll list all of them here because there's a lot. So I think I would say that I talked to many community members, but in general, the opinions that I heard were protect the environment, protect neighborhoods, strengthen neighborhoods, and yeah, I actually would say I haven't heard from a ton of people on this with very specific comments. I will say that.
Any other ex parte communication? Any declarations of abstentions from specific agenda items? And boy, I hope not. We are all on task for this one. Seeing none. We also have a time for general public comment. This would not be when you talk about the comprehensive plan, because that is an item on our agenda, but we do allow 3 minutes for any member of the public that would like to address us on items that are not on our agenda. Do we have any miscellaneous general public comment? All right. So we move on to our regular agenda, of which we have, for the most part, one item. And I'd like to talk a little bit about how we're going to tackle this. It's a little different from our regular agenda items. Usually we have a beginning, a middle, and a conclusion. And however hairy that things might get, that we have kind of a resolution at the end of each item. This won't be like that. We don't expect to answer all of the questions or solve all of the problems in this one meeting. We actually have another meeting scheduled already, which is the December, help me with the date, the 14th, the Monday, the 12th and the 14th, so the 12th, Monday the 12th, which will also discuss the comprehensive plan. We're going to hear from staff first, and then we were going to open it up to any members of the comprehensive plan steering committee, but nobody seemed to want to come out in the cold on a KU game night, so seeing none, we may not hear from them unless we hear from Patrick, who served on that committee in its entirety, and then I served on it for a short time. And then we will hear from the public. Because we have not nearly as many people as I expected to have, we will go ahead and open it up. We'll do 5 minutes for a start rather than our normal 3 minutes for each person to have a little more time. It's a huge item. If you don't get to everything, we may have a chance to call you back and ask more specific questions. So after that, then we would close that, come back to the Planning Commission for discussion, where we will, at that point, engage with you about specific things that we may have questions about. So with that, we'll start with staff.
Madam Chair, can I point out December 10th and 12th?
Monday, December 10th is the next.
What? I'm sorry, 17th and 19th, sorry. Wrong week.
Do we have a consensus?
Yeah.
Monday, December 17th is the next time that we will have a public discussion with the Planning Commission on the comprehensive plan.
Well, good evening, Commission. I'm very pleased to stand before you tonight and open up the discussion about our revised comprehensive plan. People love Lawrence and Douglas County. People love to live here. Sometimes we're a victim of our own success, and you'd think it would be because of our great downtown or maybe our stellar basketball team, but it's not. It's because we plan so dang well, and we know this to be true. And so we got to look back to Horizon 2020, which started it all in modern times, and it really has served us very well. In our opinion, though it's not perfect and many things have changed, but it has been our starting point for this effort. And today we talk about how we have to plan for sustainable communities and resilient communities, and we have to take into account the cost of infrastructure and the cost of growth and multimodal transportation networks and multi-generational housing and living. And these aren't just buzzwords. These are evolution of how we as humans live in the world and in modern times. So we've looked at Plan 2040 through a little bit different lens, I think, than Horizon 2020. not only have we looked at it through all of these kind of evolving ways that we humans live, but we also try to look at it on the backs of all of the kind of the subject matter experts that we have counted on as a community since Horizon 2020 was established. So one of the things that you will see in a minute is that P2040 really starts to embrace all the great works that so many in the community do through all the different task forces, whether it's kind of retail market or peak oil or multimodal transportation or any number, cultural arts, parks and rec. There's no way that one document can contain all that's out there to provide input into the development process. So we're looking at things a little different, and we're going to talk a little bit about that with you tonight, because it's really a different way to look at what our comprehensive plan does and how it serves us. The other thing that we've done with our comprehensive plan, generally speaking, is we've tried to coordinate at a very high level with our other development-oriented departments and organizations. So we've looked at utility master plans, and we've talked to the fire department and the police department and those who have to help serve the new growth. And after all, that's what this comprehensive plan, or any comprehensive plan, is primarily intended to do, is serve the governing bodies and the planning commission in how to accommodate growth in a community. We're very lucky that we have a positive growth rate. Not all communities do. And so it's a good challenge to have. How do you support and accommodate the growth that you can assume will come for various reasons? The third way that we approach this is really kind of more through data. It was sort of data-driven with some reasonable assumptions, looking at how much population comes, how much time it takes to get that population here, where to place them, what's the most cost-effective way to do that. So a little bit different lens. I just wanted to summarize some of that. We spent 4 years with a steering committee that really worked their tail off. There are too many people to thank, including planning commissioners. I do want to call out just a few people. Jeff Crick, obviously, you all know his efforts in this, was a primary author of the plan. The steering committee was chaired by Mike Amix and Nancy Thelman. We really appreciate their work, in particular Nancy's, for bringing it to a close in the midst of some very heated discussions. You'll see where we asked for and received the input on numerous occasions from the public in any number of different ways, and so we feel like we've really identified all of these new trends, all of these new issues that we as a community need to address. And with that, and with respect for you and your task before you, I will let Jeff go ahead and present your P2040 plan. Thank you.
Good evening, Commissioners. Jeff Crick with the City County Planning Office. It'll be a little bit of very familiar items. We'll kind of go through it a little bit like we saw at PC orientation, but I'll also try to keep it at a very high level to get the discussion rolling this evening. So Horizon 2020 has been the comprehensive plan that we've had since basically 1998, and that process got started in 1992, so it had a very long lead up before it became an adopted plan. And you can see the kind of a difference in the way that Lawrence and Douglas County look. Lawrence was about 67,000 at that point in time. Today it's about 96,000, 100,000, depending upon who you ask. So we've added quite a bit, but that was the first joint plan that we've had since 1935 when we did the first plan for the city and the county. So as part of the planning process, we really take a look at the populations and try to get an understanding of what's going on in our community and what are we going to have to be thinking about in the next 10, 15, 20 years down the line. To give you an idea, 90% of Douglas County's population would fall under the purview of Plan 2040. 79% of the population lives inside of Lawrence. The 11% are in the rural areas of the county, and the rest are in Eudora, Baldwin, and Lecompton. So the growth trends are something that we really look at, and as Scott mentioned, we're very lucky to have a positive growth rate. There are many communities that don't have that and didn't maintain that through the recession. As you can see, from 1940 to 1970, Lawrence and Douglas County just jumped in population. It's up over 200%, so it climbed at a very high rate. 1970 to 2010, that rate came down, but it was still actually impressively high for most places. A lot of communities would not even see growth rates anywhere close to this. But to give you an idea, is you can start to see as you go from 2000 to 2010 on this chart, the red line, which is the city of Lawrence, starts to kind of drop off a little bit while the blue line of Douglas County continues to go up. To us, that signifies that there is a little bit of a shift in the growing trend in the county. Eudora, Lecompton, and Baldwin are starting to grow and be part of that charge a little bit more than what Lawrence has been previously. One other thing we look at is we try to figure out how many people are going to be here, because that starts to take us to down the road of where do we need to put the schools? How many roads do we need to build? How many housing units per year do we need to start talking about? So that's what we're going to start looking with this. These are all based on the 2010 census numbers here, and we'll revise this as we get to the 2020 numbers in the coming years. But right now, we're right in between where we think we want to be, which is pretty high above that low projection, which is your green line. That kind of gray line you can see on the screen there is if that line was just to keep on moving forward. The yellow line is the medium trend, so we're in a very positive rate in that respect. To give you an idea, right now we're operating at about a 1% growth rate in the community, about 1.2%. So all the way back to 1992, when the plan got started for Horizon 2020, to what we're seeing today, you can see we've really gone up in percentages of population. So some of the assumptions and the general ideas that we saw in Horizon 2020 didn't necessarily do us wrong. They just needed a little bit of an updating to keep helping us move forward in those respects. And that was where we got started with the steering committee. They met for 4.5 years. They had 43 meetings. We can long list of them there. 2014 was their biggest year with 17 meetings in total. But it was established by the city and the county in October of 2013, and they started meeting in February of 14 to start going through the motions for this. Throughout the process, there was over 18 months of dedicated public input that came along with this. That took the forms of a statistically valid survey that we held by ETC. There were 8 open houses throughout the county from April to July of 2014. During those open houses, we also had a survey that we put out both online that you could take also at the meeting, and had 373 respondents as part of that process. The steering committee in November of 2014 held 2 public forums where they just invited everybody to come to Lawrence High School and just talk with them. You know, what do you see as a problem? What do you think the solution should be? And it was really just a gathering session to go through all the details and aspects that they had seen to that point. We'd also had a public meeting in July of 2015, which we called the Issue Action Report Listening Session. We'll get into the Issue Action Report a little bit here, but that was when they really got to find out, are we where we think we are? Did we listen to you correctly? Is there something that we need to adjust as we move forward? But the Issue Action Report was the culmination of all the public input they got, all of the testimony they received, all the letters that the public had put in. And from that, 8 priority issue items were identified and 19 key issues were brought out. This was adopted by both the city and the county commissions as part of a resolution back in 2015. So it was adopted by the city commission and the county commission. And so what this report really talks and looks at is where Horizon 2020 was still doing great, where it could be doing better, and where was it not meeting the community's expectations anymore. As you can see, the very first one there, enhance the readability of the plan. The community told us at many points along the way that Horizon 2020 was a difficult document to read. I mean, even if you could read it, it didn't quite always make sense. There was some disjointedness to the whole document. Also, addressing quality housing for all incomes was a very big portion of it. So these were the big 19 items that were kind of drawn out by the steering committee, and of those, they identified 8 priority items that needed to be addressed with the update process. Now, 2 of these have actually been completed. Item number 2, we think we've done with the plan update itself, is to enhance the readability of the plan. And item number 8, which is to update the Lawrence Parks and Recreation Master Plan, was completed along the way. So they actually began and ended theirs before we even got here this evening. So that master plan has been adopted by the City Commission already. But the other items you can see there, one of the first and foremost things that we heard quite frequently throughout the county, not just the city of Lawrence, but in every part of the county, was to create employment opportunities. That was the big takeaway that we had from those meetings. Addressing quality housing, providing for arts and culture amenities. One thing that they very called out was that discussion that we tend to have here at the Planning Commission about, does Lawrence need to grow out or does Lawrence need to grow up? So is an increasing height and density in certain locations to make sure we preserve farmland? Is that a priority? How do we address that item? We also heard a very strong support for local food system development and policy around that. And also just making sure that our neighborhoods not only are quality for all incomes, but they're also great places for all ages. So a lot of the policies we're starting to develop came from the issue action report, and we're working to address the priority items that we heard from the community. So I'll start kind of going through what we call the update guide. And this is a very handy guide, and I like to refer to it as the document that walks you from Horizon 2020 to the new Plan 2040. So it guides you from what, okay, this was in Chapter 14. I knew exactly where this is. Where does it show up now in the new plan? So it walks you from the new to the old, or excuse me, from the old to the new. But it outlines the changes along the way and what has occurred inside the plan, those key policies that have been altered. And it also talks about the ways that the new plan engages the items in the issue action report. We really view the update guide as serving as almost not just the crosswalk file going between the two, but as an executive summary about how it kind of evolved and changed from Horizon 2020 going into Plan 2040. So we think that's a very important document in the respect. And before I kind of go through the plan here, I just wanted to kind of mention the way that a comprehensive plan works, just in case anybody would like to know more details to it. The comprehensive plan, as we were talking about in this, it really is the guide for future development. And it's very understandable when you look at Horizon 2020 and you read it. It reads a lot like a zoning code. At the time, that was its intent. It had to carry a lot of weight. That has kind of changed over time as we've adopted the land development code, as the county zoning regulations have been updated, the subdivision regulations have come online. We've also had a change in the community where we've had a lot of great plans that have been done by a lot of our task force and steering committee that Scott mentioned. So using the knowledge of the subject matter experts and those bodies that were put together to address a very specific focus is something we just wanted to piggyback on. We didn't want to recreate the wheel. We wanted to use that knowledge and progress forward. So one thing that really changes between Horizon 2020 and Plan 2040 is the reliance on what we call reference plans. So some of us know them as sector plans, which are your land use plans you have, but also relying on plans that are not necessarily in Horizon 2020 today. Peak oil task force, climate adaptation plans, emergency response plans, a lot of our transportation plans that go on with our metropolitan planning organization. So instead of recreating all of that good work, all that public comment, those priorities that they've set, we incorporate those by reference when they address a land use item. And so that's kind of the way that we carry this forward, is that we're starting to take that comprehensive plan language and start applying it down through the zoning regulations and into the development applications that you tend to see with a site plan, special use permit, a conditional use permit. So if you think about it this way, the comprehensive plan is the guide that really starts to set it up. The zoning implements the actions and the policies that you see in the comprehensive plan. And once it's set in the zoning, then when we start reviewing applications for site plans and redevelopment, that's when we really apply it to the ground with the planning staff. But the plan itself here for Plan 2040, I'll mention, it really goes around 4 key tenets here. And the steering committee actually set up a subcommittee to work on what they called the mission vision statement. And it was a team of 4 individuals, including Chair Thelman, John Gascon, Bill Ackerley, and Lisa Harris, who met separately of the steering committee to draft this this mission vision that really sets the whole thing in action here. The whole plan is based around the concept of live, work, learn, and play. It's the 4 parts of the community that we all interact with. It's the 4 parts that we all tend to look. We tried to make sure that the plan addressed this in every aspect as it went through the entire process. So kind of going into the high-level parts of the plan here, as we mentioned earlier, readability and continuity were very big items that we strove for in the planning process, trying to make sure that it read as a single document, it had a syntax, a feel to it. But we also wanted to make sure that we did word choice and writing styles that were accessible, that weren't, for lack of a better word, they weren't planner language. They weren't something that read like a zoning code. We wanted it to be approachable by anybody. We also wanted to make sure that the maps in there update as stuff changes. If you look at a map from Horizon 2020, one in particular jumps to mind, it has not been updated since 1998. It looks exactly like it was when the plan was adopted. The city limits is quite small, there's roads missing, you have a hard time placing it in the community today. The way that we introduced the interactive mapping was if it's an item that is controlled by the comprehensive plan, a land use designation, a commercial node, or something like that, it would be updated when the amendment is complete. But for things that are just normal everyday occurrences, a city limit line changes, a new road comes online, or a park is adopted and put on the map, the maps will update themselves automatically. So as roads come and go, or if plans are developed, or as a park is put in place, the maps take care of themselves in the updates. So if you're familiar with the community today, those maps will look exactly what you expect to see if you looked on Google Maps. So the intent is for them to be very interactive. The other thing is they have capabilities of turning things on and off. So if you want to see what is an existing commercial node versus a planned commercial node, you can turn those on and off and you can get a really good view of it. You can click on things and it'll tell you data behind the scenes that wasn't available in Horizon 2020. So we spend a lot of time working those maps up and making them very interactive, very intuitive, and very approachable, we hope, by the public. We also, as I mentioned, started working in reference plans, which you'll see in both the appendix, which is the Chapter 8, kind of going backwards, but also with our implementation. But we really put a renewed emphasis on some things that we heard during the public input process. The people said, this is working wonderfully and we want to keep it up. We really want this to continue on for the next 20 years. So as you look through the plan, the things that we heard about was protecting and enhancing our rural character. Same with the agricultural uses in the community, working to make sure the downtown Lawrence is stable and preserved for the next generation moving forward. And really one of the big ones we heard was, besides just employment opportunities, but it was really just changing the way that retail exists in our community. We heard a lot about neighborhood retail, about having it where you could walk from your house to go to a certain establishment, or I don't want to get in a car, but I want to go to a coffee shop. So changing the mindset about how we locate what we expect commercial really occurs in the growth and development chapter, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But we also spend a lot of time hearing about ways to enhance our transportation network, not just driving, but bicycling, walking, mass transit, all of the aspects about moving around the community, and not just inside the city of Lawrence, but going from community to community in the county. So relying heavily on the MPO's good work is one thing that we take advantage of. We also have some very new additions to the plan that are not anywhere inside of Horizon 2020. Discussion about affordable housing is in the Lawrence neighborhood chapter. You'll also hear some information there about the arts and culture and food system development that are not available in Horizon 2020. These are things that have come online since 2020 really had a last good update that we're going to bring into the plan. One thing we think it really does is it kind of goes to the comments we heard in the public about bolstering rural land uses and those rural amenities that we heard. If you ever read Horizon 2020, if you ever think about it as a map, you can tell exactly where it kind of got its start and which way it went. It started in downtown Lawrence and pushed its way out. We tried to write the comprehensive plan the opposite direction. We've tried to write it from the county lines into downtown. So we put a very strong emphasis on that rural nature, the agricultural part of our community, and take a look at that first and foremost, and then work our way into the urban center. So that, as we hopefully transpires and comes through in the pages. And then we'll start going into the chapters themselves here. Growth and development is chapter 2. This is a combination of 4 separate chapters in Horizon 2020 that we brought together because they are almost interlinked in every way possible. And if you read them in Horizon 2020, they don't read sometimes like they were ever linked at all. Sometimes they contradict, sometimes they're disjointed, sometimes they don't come into the same alignment at all. So we tried to really work that out. And like I just mentioned, we really wanted to make sure the rural aspects were brought into that community. So a strong emphasis on the character, minimizing non-agricultural residential development outside of the urban growth area, and also just streamlining commercial locations in the rural areas, both process and location options in that respect. We also looked at housing types and variety. One I mentioned during the issue action report was that people wanted to age in place. That term planners use all the time. But the best way to think about it is you can live in a neighborhood your entire life and just change houses but never change neighborhoods. So as you want to go up in a house size or go down in house size, those options are available to you. So that is one thing that we're trying to really take a good look at in this plan. We also look at talking about compatible density. Not just in within certain areas, but also across land uses and within other areas itself. So it's not just it stops in my neighborhood, but how the neighborhoods engage with areas around them too. How do they come to a street? What is the best way to have these connections pushed through? It also talks about accommodating and designing for that next level growth that we expect. We'll get into some of the details here. I'm sure you all remember some of the details from the PC orientation about the population and the modeling process and things like that. But a good thing to keep in mind is that Lawrence is probably going to add 1,000 people a year for the next 20 years. So you work that out, we're going to need somewhere in the neighborhood of 300 to 500 houses. We're going to need to start planning for our schools. We're going to need to plan for our streets, our walkways, our park system. So about 1,000 people a year, just kind of keep that in mind as a general growth rate. And really, we started looking at some of those commercial options that we heard about, specifically, again, the rural commercial options. But we really wanted to streamline the text, and we created a commercial criteria table. So if you look at a commercial chapter in Horizon 2020, it's a very lengthy chapter. And sometimes it's repetitive, and sometimes it's kind of hard to follow along. We took that chapter and distilled it down into a table so that you could see across the zoning categories and all the future land uses what they kind of compare to. And so kind of a way to make that approachable and easier to understand was a good way to do it. So we'll talk about kind of the big portion here for growth and development, which is just, again, accommodating the growth. To give you an idea, the best information that we had when we ran the model, and we kind of looked at it, was there was approximately 21 years of multi-dwelling inventory on the ground inside the city of Lawrence. So if you figure out the amount of land we have versus how many permits are pulled, we have enough land or zone in that respect to probably last us for about 21 years. From a residential standpoint, from a single-family residential standpoint, we have probably somewhere between 7 years, and I think 7 years is probably a pretty high number right now. I think knowing the way that the market's changed over time, I think it's much lower than 7 currently. But when we did it, it was 21 years of multifamily, 7 years of single-dwelling residential. So we had a little bit of capacity in that one. We'll go through some of the numbers here, but I'll give you the highlight number right now. There is about 17,400 of an estimated population that we could add inside Lawrence's city limits today. Just kind of a rough number coming out of the model. And we talk a little bit about the growth areas, and we'll go through some of the details of that one too. But to give you an idea, Tier 2 is about 8 square miles of land around the city. It's the green that you can see on the map right now. Tier 3, which is the orange part of the map, is really the bulk and remaining of our urban growth area that was adopted in Horizon 2020. We decided not to really change the urban growth area with the one exception of the Northeast Area Plan, which recommended pulling out a large portion of it. As you can kind of see, it kind of looks like an apostrophe kind of coming up off the, I don't know how to describe it other than an apostrophe there. Normally that would go all the way up to the county lines and be very squared off, but that area plan recommended retracting a lot of that out of the urban growth area because it was prime agricultural land, it was prone to flooding, it wasn't something that we recognized as a community we wanted to develop. So we pulled that out of the map as that. So that's why it kind of looks a little different in that part. But we think when you look at the capacity that we have inside of Tier 1 and Tier 2, that would carry us well through 2040 to a population of 124,000. So we'll kind of go really quickly into some of the questions that we asked as we do this. And Scott set me up perfectly for this when we were talking about data and analytics with this. We really applied the technology that we had, the ability we had to do with our mapping and our GIS systems to figure out where are we going to be going. The Horizon 2020 urban growth area was just drawn kind of, we think it's going to be this, and that seems pretty okay. And it works. It works by all chance. I won't say anything wrong with it. But we tried to apply some numbers to that to really figure out where are we going to grow? At what speed are we going to get there? Do we have enough land covered right now to do it? Or are we really short going one direction? So we really started looking at what is our population now? What is our annual growth rate? And where do we think we're going to be going? And that's where we relied on the sector plans and the good work that's been done in the last 10 years on those. But the questions we still had to ask were, how much? How much land do we need? Where do we need it to be going to? And then the other question is, can we serve it? It's one thing to put houses in the ground, but if you can't get water, sewer, fire, transportation links to them, people are not really going to want to go that direction. So we started to constrain this with a little bit of an expectation that people have in their community. And just to give you an idea, some of the stuff we really looked at in the issue action report for this was the big things we heard from the issue action was managing Lawrence's future growth, encouraging infill development, considering the increase of height and density in appropriate locations, and importantly, most importantly, is to enhance the agricultural uses and rural character of the county. So when we did this study, we kept those 4 items in mind as a way of trying to containing the entire process. So I mentioned earlier, Tier 1 is going to be inside of Lawrence's current city limits. Tier 2 will be where we think will kind of grow during this plan's time horizon. And Tier 3 will be the area beyond the plan's time horizon, effectively beyond 2040 in those respects. So Tier 1, city limits. That's no way to describe it. That is the Lawrence city limits today. So that gets us to tier 2, where we start talking about how are we going to grow? Where is this going to be at? How fast do we need to be thinking about it? And so what we took was we started looking down our technology and our maps that we have and said, okay, let's start giving it some very good parameters here. This is the urban growth area from Horizon 2020, the red line you can see there. And we said, okay, water likes to flow downhill, so for sewer systems, we need to be thinking about that. So which way does the water go? And then does that correspond with what we're seeing? And then we asked our utilities department, the MSO now, can you serve it? How can you take care of the water, the wastewater, the stormwater process that you see there? So the red you see on the map here, it is serviceable. It would just take a considerable amount of enhancements to the system to occur. So it wouldn't necessarily be impossible, it just wouldn't be cheap in some respects. The orange area that you can see kind of up to the northwest there, actually looks a little bit yellow on the screens there, my apologies, kind of up towards the northwest there, that can be served with some system enhancements. So utilities reported back to us, we can get there pretty easily, we just need to know what we need to do. The green area, that was where they said, we're good right now, we can take care of this today. And then we talked to the fire department, and we said, okay, we know that you have a requirement for a response rate that you have to be able to get from a station to a call in 6 minutes. And then they gave us this piece of information you can see here. This is their coverage radius for when they get a call, how fast they can get to somewhere in 6 minutes. And then we took all of that and layered on top of it the future land use maps from all the sector plans that we have inside of Horizon 2020. And we didn't discount any particular land use. If it was in that sector plan, we put it into this analysis process. And what the computer returned was the green area you see here, and that makes up tier 2. So it's something that we can both serve, it covers our needs, and it works out to be about 8 square miles around the city. And when you follow our growth rates out, it tends to serve us pretty well. Tier 3 is just the future growth area that kind of goes around, that's not in tier 1 and tier 2. To give you an idea, the sector plans we have today only cover about 20% of the urban growth area that you have left remaining here. So a large mass of that urban growth area is not even inside of a sector plan currently. It's just on the map as part of the urban growth area. But the real fun with numbers kind of picks up when we start looking at this in totality here. Lawrence's population, when we last run the model through, was just under 100,000. But if the model worked out and said, okay, I've got this much land, I can add about 17,000 inside the city limits. I can add about another 18,000 inside of tier 2. And if you follow our growth trend and our projections across the board, that would get us into a population that would be very well covered by 2050. So we're actually got 10 years of kind of wiggle room in some respects there. But by 2040, we would estimate the population of Lawrence to be about 123,000. So the real kind of the details of the plan, after we went through all that motion, was we started looking back at the issue action report and those 4 policies I mentioned and trying to find ways to incorporate that preservation and protection of the rural lands. So that starts to take root in Chapter 2. We also really talked about prioritizing infill development. One of the key items we heard was emphasize infill development as part of our issue action report and our public input. So we prioritized infill development at all times in Plan 2040. With Tier 2, we tried to take a very reasoned and focused approach to growth, which isn't necessarily something that's groundbreaking. A lot of communities do it, but it might be the first time we've really applied what we have here and tried to figure out the speed, the timing, and what we can actually serve all in the same time. So we think it's a way to accommodate the demand, but it also has some components in there to make sure that it's not just it's a give and take in some respects. The current annexation policy the city has, I think I've heard it described one time as a come one, come all, we'll take anything kind of an annexation policy. We're trying to kind of meter that out a little bit and say we can grow, but we got to realize there is a cost component to the growth. We might have to build more streets. We might have to accommodate different sewer capacities. We might need to improve certain expectations the community has. So trying to figure out that give and take balance has been dropped into the plan. Also just really looking at, not writing Tier 3 off as a no in some ways, but as, what does it do for us in the longer term? So really looking at Tier 3 in a much longer time frame, kind of further down the road than even this plan's time horizon, to make sure we have it set up for that next plan when it's written. And we'll kind of go through some of the other chapters here real quick too. Neighborhoods and housing is a brand new chapter to Plan 2040. We really worked on trying to strengthen the character of neighborhoods, the connectivity of the neighborhoods to each other. Again, just working through items about aging in place so that you can live in the same neighborhood your entire life and just change housing as you need it to do. One thing we also did was we worked in the Affordable Housing Advisory Board's policies and implementation items that they're coming up with on the city side of things. They're doing a lot of great work. They're generating a lot of good research and data. And this is one of those where we really thought there's no reason at all to recreate the wheel. Let's rely on them as the experts and their data to find out what part of our community we need to focus on, what income segments need the most help. So we're really relying on that as part of this. We also kind of took some other portions of other chapters that didn't necessarily always kind of come together in the cleanest of ways. It looked like they were kind of added on, and we tried to pull them together into one cohesive item about neighborhoods. So we really tried to pull everything together to make one strong chapter in that respect. Of course, we also looked at transportation, and for this one, it'd be no surprise that it was a very big item on the issue action report, but we also decided we're going to continue the same trend that we've been doing for years now and bring in T2040, Transportation 2040, which is the MPO's Metropolitan Transportation Plan, and make that our chapter because it has the research, the expertise, the knowledge to just carry forward. What we did try to do was we try to strengthen the linkages between the Metropolitan Transportation Plan and the Comprehensive Plan by really connecting these 4 items that you see here on the screen. So really working in options and choices into the land use policy considerations. And also just making sure that we link those back to land use items coming out of T2040. We really focused on safety and security of the network, so making sure that when we're doing developments and platting and those items that we're encouraging walkability and bikeability as part of that just foundational aspect as we start bringing those comprehensive plan goals from the 30,000 foot level through the zoning and through the subdivision regs, so they really get applied on the ground. But we also wanted to make sure that whatever system we built was equitable and efficient for everybody. And so we really worked that strongly into the land use linkages in the chapter. And of course, we also looked at economic development, which I mentioned earlier, was the highest priority we heard coming out of public input. So we really worked to align our efforts with our community partner efforts, with the Chamber of Commerce, with EDC, with KU, and trying to do those workforce development items, specifically retention and attraction of businesses, but also kind of getting out and ahead of those emerging economies, those things we don't even know are coming next. When Horizon 2020 was written, I don't think fiber optic was really that wasn't on the radar as being a big thing, but now that's a big draw. That is a very big part of land use planning in some communities. So just being aware of that next level item, kind of getting out and ahead of it. Green technology might be it. I'm not sure. If I knew that, I'd probably go buy a lottery ticket and then get ahead of the curve too. But whatever it is, we want to be ready for that next step. And with natural resources chapter, it was chapter, I believe, 16. I get my numbers a little mixed up at this point between the 2 plans. But 16 rolled into 6 there. We really expanded and redefined what sensitive lands are in the context of the comprehensive plan. So we expanded them beyond the normal land uses, applying them to commercial, residential, and industrial. We also worked up floodplain protections a little bit stronger than what you'll see in Horizon 2020. We also started laying the groundwork for a climate adaptation plan that we've been told from the Sustainability Office is something that we need to do. It doesn't really go with Horizon 2020, and it didn't really kind of go with Plan 2040, but we wanted to lay the foundation so that when it is done and it is ready, it can come right in as a reference plan and develop into it. So that is a big component of what we looked at. Speaking of the sensitive lands, we really expanded native prairies as a sensitive land, endangered species habitat, floodplains and floodways a little bit more than what was under the old plan, but we also really worked up the protections of those items too. And community resources is one we kind of started pulling together a couple different chapters and kind of really putting it together. First and foremost, we're talking about probably historic resources in downtown Lawrence in that respect. They came together seamlessly in this item. This was a very big issue in the issue action report, was preserving our community's character, both urban and rural. And I mentioned earlier the Parks and Rec master plan that was already adopted as part of kind of before this one got through here. We just seamlessly rolled that into it too. We knew that their issues, their policies, we worked that into the Parks and Rec and open space chapter. Community facilities is also one that got pulled out of Horizon 2020, kind of brought right over into this chapter here. It gives deference to the community to the CIP process, those capital improvement plans that are going on for the city and the county. You'll see a lot of language in Horizon 2020 that will talk about siting of different things. I think one good example is schools. The language in there probably doesn't mesh with what USD 497 and the Perry-LeCompton School District have in mind today, but it's still in our comprehensive plan. So we're really trying to give deference back to those entities and say, here's some general ideas, but we understand you have a process you need to go through, and it needs to match a little with ours in that respect. And of course, two of our newcomers here, our local food system plan, or excuse me, local food element came into this chapter there, which references back to our local food plan. Also, the community arts and culture plan that the city of Lawrence has was incorporated into this part as the community resource itself. So I will just really quickly here talk about what we call a forecasting item here. You know, things that we know that are not going to be solved immediately, and some things that are going to take some very good community discussion is, how are we going to design and accommodate that growth we know is coming? Our model worked on a 1% growth rate, which is just a little less than the 1.2 that we're currently seeing right now. But if we're adding 1,000 people, how are we going to take care of that? So what does height and density look like? And then the question really becomes, how do we want to grow? What does that form look like to us? What do we think is best to make Lawrence still be Lawrence in the coming years? And just really working to preserve the economy and the character of our rural areas along with our urban areas. It's a hard dichotomy. It's a conversation that we're going to have. Really, employment opportunities is a big one, not just kind of the base strength of our employment, but the options. And I think it really is thinking about what's the next big thing? What is that next big economy that we want to be ready for? Really designing inclusive neighborhoods. And I think it's best described by all ages, all incomes, and all needs. So thinking about neighborhoods in maybe a different way than what we normally tend to do, but really it's all ages, incomes, and needs to be thought about. And of course, really working through sensitive lands and floodplains. So really building on the good work that was set up in Chapter 16 in Horizon 2020, but broadening it out and strengthening it based on the community input we heard through the public input process. And also just really looking at those transportation connections, going beyond roadways. So not just, like I mentioned earlier, not just roads and streets and highways, but bike lanes and paths and those other items that the community has an expectation for. And then just making sure whatever work we do there is efficient and equitable for everybody. So that is an extremely fast and very high-level look at a document that's about 120 pages long. And with that, I'd be glad to stand for any questions you have and any comments.
Thank you, Jeff. We will have plenty. So I guess we're ready to open it up to the community, for the public. As you come forward, if you would both write down your name and address, and also tell us your name and please spell it for us, because we're taking notes as you speak. Who wants to go first?
Thank you. I'm Thad Holcomb at 1817 Leonard Avenue, and I'm here as the moderator for LETUS, Lawrence Ecology Team United Sustainability. We're an interfaith network of 8 green teams, which are affiliated with the Muslim, Catholic, Protestant, and Jewish traditions here in Lawrence. I want to start with, really, if I may, a quote that I actually submitted to you when I give a written submission about our suggestions for amendments to the 2040 plan, and it's from a kind of a saint of ecology, and some of you know Aldo Leopold. He says, "We shall never achieve harmony with land any more than we shall achieve absolute justice or liberty for people in their higher aspirations. The important thing is not to achieve, but to strive." I think really, in a lot of ways, 2040 plan is moving in that direction, but I want to ask you to consider possible amendments. I'm not going to be sharing anything new with any of you, I don't think, when I describe a context that prompts our desire to be in support of amending the 2040 Comprehensive Plan. The context is, you and I know that we're living in a society that is beginning to recognize the consequences of climate change and a recognition that water, air, and land are not resources in and of themselves. Our history, the history of our predominant culture, is one where we have used the word of choice, resource, to describe, and if not describe, assume that the value of the earth's living web of life has value primarily in relation to her being of use to you and me. As a result, we have, in many cases, in contrast to what Leopold has said, harmony with land, a fouling of land, water, and air without regard to the intrinsic value that they have. Therefore, they've become commodities. We can trade, we can sell, and use often without much regard for consequences, which has been the case in the past of our culture. Fortunately, we have developed a way to resist and even re-educate. The development of a comprehensive plan for 24 is to be commended as a way to possibly reorient and educate ourselves and recognize our arrogance. Let us, along with many other organizations and individuals in Lawrence and Douglas County, would like to support the plan. But in doing so, Lettuce is asking for the 2040 comprehensive plan to be amended, particularly in the environmental area. We are particularly asking that the environment, the context in which planning for human activity occurs, be recognized for its importance. Hence, we ask that 2020, the old one, Chapter 16, be amended and used in each 2040 plan. The written statement you've received from us provides a possible framework for that. We ask that an amended overview statement in the 2020 plan, which is an introduction that provides a rationale, along with the rest of land management, etc., included in that, we ask that it be promoted to a higher chapter, more to the front of the line, or at least the beginning of the written plan. This would communicate, which is important, to the reader, the urgent need for the environment to be given priority. It is the effect on land, air, and water that needs to be given more importance when decisions are being made regarding growth and future development in Lawrence and Douglas County. This priority of the environment can be communicated through the plan when development concerns of housing, streets, infrastructure, etc. are considered. We think that such a priority will provide a framework for decision-making when taking actions that affect the quality of life for all in Douglas and Douglas County, in Lawrence and Douglas County. This quote, "I own the land, and therefore I have a right to do with it as I please." I heard that often since I came from a ranching community in Oklahoma. It's often said by landowners or people that own real estate, business, corporations, and is a statement that I was raised with, as I mentioned before. But the result of such a statement is, in many ways, the path to where we are now, with the desecration of land, air, and water. It has resulted truly in a tragedy of the commons. The legal right of owning needs to be questioned. There is a need to acknowledge the tension of such a statement when recognizing the integrity of land, air, and water. Again, land, air, and water are not simply resources. This understanding is confirmed in an ecological understanding that affirms we, you and I, are part of the web of life. Instead, we often act as bullies and decide for the earth what is best to our detriment. We want to support, Lettuce does, and others, a comprehensive plan that leads us into the future, where we in Douglas County and Lawrence can point to a plan that does not avoid the inevitable conflict that arises with growth and future development. They'll happen. Growth will happen. The quality of that growth will be determined on the basis of how much value we give to all of life, and hopefully not with undue emphasis on economic well-being for anyone. And the 2040 plan has the possibility of, as Aldo Leopold has stated, being a plan that strives, at least strives, to achieve harmony with land. Thank you for this opportunity for us to share with you and for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Holcomb. Now, I've given Thad 6 minutes. Would you also like 6 minutes? To be fair, we can spread that
think so.
around. We have time.
Good evening. I'm Penny Von Aken, 1346 East 2350 Road in Eudora, east of Eudora. Chairwoman Willie, commissioners, it's good to be here and see you, and thank you for allowing us to speak. My comments are going to be referring to Chapter 6, the Natural Resources chapter in 2040. I want what I think we all want for a comprehensive plan, and that is clarity, substance, utility, and direction. My concern is that we've taken Chapter 16, the Environment chapter from Horizon 2020, and took those 30 pages and condensed them down to 4.5 pages for 2040. And in that process, we've lost a lot of that clarity, direction, substance, and direction, and utility. When we've done that, we've lost a lot of the specificity that we had in 2020. Each chapter in 2040 consists of 3 tiers, as I know you all know. There's the overall vision, what the community would like to see. There are some general goals, and then there are action items under those goals. Those action items are a means to achieve the goals. And they are, according to the plan, specific statements providing measurable strategies. But all too often, they're neither specific nor measurable. And in fact, they're oftentimes goals. Many of them are policies taken from Horizon 2020 and now called action goals in 2020. But like I said, too often they are goals with no means to achieve them. So what we've lost, in my opinion, in this new plan is direction, is how to achieve the goals that are outlined. For example, an action item of Plan 2040 speaks to prioritizing wildlife habitats for protection, but it doesn't say how. If you go back to Horizon 2020, there's a number of things that suggest, including regulating placement of roads, trails, and utilities so as not to fragment natural habitats. Also, by permitting only low-impact development with environmentally sensitive design in areas of critical habitat. So which of these is the most useful? Which provides the clearest direction? Without specific actions, I'm not even sure how you tell if something is compliant with the plan. Most specific action strategies from Horizon 2020 have been omitted from the new plan, but the devil is in the detail, and this omission is a critical loss. Everybody wants clean air, clean water, they like pretty trees. It's how we implement them that's critical, and that's where the contention lies, but that's what's been taken out of this plan. So that when development issues come up, this ambiguity can cause an awful lot of conflict. And how it's implemented, it can be up for grabs because it's not outlined in the comprehensive plan. If specific strategies are not spelled out in the plan, they probably won't be implemented. And important environmental protections are lost. And that's my whole concern. We do not lose what we currently have won in environmental protections. The comp plan is used by the Planning Commission every month to decide on vital public projects, vital decisions that you make on behalf of the community. But much of the usefulness of this plan has been lost by the generalities and lack of specific action items. Please rethink this chapter and incorporate specific language for implementation strategies. I'd also like to say, since I have a little extra time, I'd like to comment on something that Jeff said. He talked about how they've taken a lot of these things and incorporated them in special land use plans and sector plans. And I think that's great. It should be done that way. But I don't think you need to take them out of Chapter 6 to do that. I think we need to accommodate the person from the community who goes to Chapter 6 looking for information on a specific topic. If all they find are the goals and they don't find how they're going to be implemented and some of the other information, they're not going to get the full picture. If they cared enough to go to the comprehensive plan in the first place, they probably care enough to want to know all of the information about that topic. So I would suggest, as well as incorporating it in the land use plans, sector plans, what have you, that it also be left in Chapter 6, so one can follow the thread from vision to goal to action item and implementation. I think that's all I have to say. I want to thank Jeff for all of his work and the steering committee for their 4.5 years of work and labor on this monumental task. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening, Commissioners, Chairwoman Willie. Hugh Carter, I'm with the Lawrence Chamber of Commerce. I wasn't really expecting to speak tonight because I also expected a full room and several-hour meeting and lots of folks giving testimony. But I really just want to set the stage a little bit, I think, for where we are in the process here, because Jeff, Scott, the staff has done a great job of working on this and trying to draw public input. The 4.5-year steering committee, I know from observing that it was a challenge to get public input. As you can imagine, this is a kind of overwhelming document, and you as planning commissioners are all at various levels of expertise. For those that are new, I was 2 years on the planning commission and then served on the city commission after that. And I know just enough to know that planning is difficult. So the unintended consequences are the biggest challenge. And the comprehensive development plan is such a highly interpretive document. That's what you're dealing with every month when these projects come in front of you. You're making recommendations, and typically you're sorting out different folks' interpretations. And the devil is in the details. It's in the language and how it's written. Early on, I know that committee struggled mightily to really get public input again because I think folks were really overwhelmed. You don't have a lot of people that are terribly interested or knowledgeable about the details of the plan. So the committee did a great job of saying, no, we're not going to move forward without that public input. So we're going to schedule meetings and we're going to actually request and invite specific groups to come in and speak to, even if it's specific chapters, and break it off in a little more bite-sized units. And that created some more input. Probably not as much as we'd like, but there was input. Ultimately, and because of that, I think that was over about an 18-month period there, the issue action report was then developed. It's 12 font probably, good pictures, diagrams, I think kind of wide margins. So, and I don't know if I said, but 20, 24 pages. It's not a terribly long document, giving some guidance from the steering committee on the type of changes or the thoughts they'd like considered when we revise the comp plan. I write positions for the chamber and on virtually everything related to government relations, and wrote a support letter for the great work the steering committee had done. We didn't have any concerns with what we saw in the recommendations there. And however, as we said in the letter, we really understood that the rubber hits the road now when the planning staff starts to try and craft and put those recommendations into the plan itself, because that's where, again, the language, it means everything, and the interpretations begin. So we were looking forward to that process, and really under the impression that would be done in bite-sized chunks as well, and we could really massage and get to that language, give feedback. So, and not that anyone was misleading, that was just my understanding. So it was about a year later, I think, that planning staff delivered the plan that you're seeing now. The entire plan rewritten in one fell swoop based on those recommendations in that short report. And with that, there's not even a redlined version of the it's not redlined, so you can't go to look at the previous plan and say, okay, what was changed? It's completely rewritten. It's a completely new plan, and as Jeff said earlier, to their credit, I think that staff has been trying to get away from some of that planner language and make it more accessible. And with that, again, that's an entire change in the language as well, interpretations. And so that's an awful lot in one fell swoop. So I'm really here to just say that as you look at the plan, even though you see a lot of process, 4.5 years of a steering committee, et cetera, the plan that's in front of you now really just came on the scene. We just got to look at that a few months back, and there was a 30, 45-day window for public to give input on that, which again, difficult to get it the first time around. We took several years to develop that input. And so the public input on this current plan, I would argue, was a little minimal as well. I grabbed 12 or 14 different people that I felt like worked within and worked with the plan, had a little expertise, land use attorneys, architects, et cetera, to say, hey, can we get some feedback here? Because I sure as heck can't go through this entire plan and give meaningful feedback on what are the consequences of this, that, and the other chapters. And that group was very overwhelmed as well. We did send a letter that, outlined a lot of concerns from that group, and I think some of those were addressed by staff. We never really got into conversations on that. By the time the plan came back to that steering committee, again, one fell swoop, entirely rewritten plan, it wasn't the same steering committee even. We had new members who, again, were like, bottom line is, we were told, let's get this to the Planning Commission and continue the conversation. But what's in front of you now Jeff did a great overview there, but so much of all of that process was just what staff was doing with that recommendation, that issue action report. And so there's a lot of work to be done from now this entirely rewritten report. I would just urge you to please take this either chapter by chapter or group a few at a time here and there, the ones that make sense. Some of this can move more quickly. But to several speakers' points here too, it could be that it's an issue of specificity, it could be that it's an issue of just not being clear in language, so leaving us open for interpretation. In some cases, I know of just one item, and it's the public benefit. Not sure the steering committee really put that forth. I think in the end, when we say our number one priority right now as a community is affordable housing, then we want to be careful about adding regulations that in fact drive up the cost of housing and work against that, especially when we just came out in support of, and I wrote the letter to support from the Chamber's standpoint, the tax on affordable housing. So let's not offset that with regulation. I just touch on that very briefly because it's really the one thing you'll probably hear from me again on. But overall, if I could just say anything, it's please take your time, break this down. There's no rush. You're not overturning the committee's work. The committee didn't really have time to look and really give thoughtful, I think, feedback on the plan as it is right now. So my message would just be no rush, and please give us time for feedback. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for giving me an opportunity to address the Planning Commission. Thank you all for your service. My name is Teresa Wilkie. I live at 3221 Yellowstone Drive, Lawrence. I moved to Lawrence in 1982, and I grew up in Olathe, Kansas, and I remember when there wasn't a 10 highway into Lawrence. And I remember the old 10 highway, and I remember the new 10 highway, and there was a yellow flashing light by the farmland plant. And in years after, generally the people in Lawrence seemed to think that yellow flashing light was because of weather or something. But I grew up and remembered very well that big yellow clouds of sulfurous emissions came from farmland and sat on the new 10 highway. And the city put a yellow flashing light because you couldn't see traffic at all. And that was a pollution problem. And we still live, heaven's sakes, 40 years later with that pollution problem because the farmland plant it's full of pollution. So when you address a plan on comprehensive planning, it's good to have a plan that recognizes that humans create waste and it needs to be addressed, and we're very serious about that as a community. So I want to read to you from Chapter 16, 2020, the old plan. The overview is specific. Quote, require sustainability of existing natural resources and climate protection are increasingly recognized as equally important to the health and vitality of the community and must be protected for future generations. I don't see anything the equivalent of that in 2040. And I believe to put an overarching statement in the 2040 plan that says we recognize the importance of sustaining our environment and protecting our people from future jeopardy with the effects of waste and pollution would really help this plan. Now, I do see in 2040 recognition of the great work of Helen Schnoes in the food policy. It says food policy in more than one place, and that's a good thing. But I have been to meetings of the Sustainability Advisory Board, and they've come up with very good policy heading towards STAR certification. And I know they made recommendations to the city based on all their work. I know they give monthly reports to the city based on all their work. And I didn't see a thing in the building chapter about STAR certification, and I think that that's a mistake. When you have advisory groups giving you information like this, you really need to recognize it across the board. You need to try to pick up every one of them across the board. The old plan has goals and strategies in Chapter 16. I'm missing any kind of goal and strategy in the new plan. I do note that it generally talks about green spaces in Chapter 3, neighborhoods and housings. And I would like to see it be more specific about standards for proper disposal of daily and hazardous waste. I would like to see it say something about fracking, which is another waste issue that we're dealing with, and reference what can be done and what to protect the environment and the people who live here from issues like fracking. So I thank you very much. I just think the new plan is too general, has pictures of smiley people to fill space, and I'm glad to see smiley people, and I'm glad that the pictures are they're men, women, all races, all ages, and that's a good thing. But the old plan was not too wordy. It had good protections there, and we need to have those in our comprehensive plan. So thank you.
Thank you. Do you have any other public comment?
I'm Kathy Dwiggins, representing the Heritage Conservation Council of Douglas County. The Heritage Conservation Council is appointed by the Douglas County Commission and includes at least 3 preservation professionals, architects, landscape architects, and other areas, as well as 4 lay people who have interests in preservation. And as we noted in the letter, the memo that we provided, the issue for us is that the Heritage Conservation Council have the opportunity to participate in the implementation of the plan, and particularly because our purpose is to preserve the natural and cultural heritage of the county, and that crosses many of the areas addressed in the plan. Not only natural resources and community resources, where historic resources are included as one element, but also things, economic development, transportation, many things are included in natural and cultural heritage. And the Heritage Conservation Council is responsible for implementing grants supported by and approved by the Douglas County Commission, and also surveying the resources of the county. We have completed 13 surveys to date of the resources. We're working by township at 2 levels of detail, a kind of reconnaissance survey and then an intensive survey to identify and incorporate into the Kansas State Historical Society Heritage Resource Inventory information on the resources of the county. And we've also supported a survey of the natural resources. On our list to be done shortly is a survey of the archaeological resources of the county. So we're gathering a lot of information on the resources. We have professionals involved in working on that, and we feel, and we're a county appointed advisory group. So we think that we should be incorporated in the process as it moves forward, not just the historic resources focused on in the description, especially on structures, but also in all of the other elements that make Douglas County and the unincorporated areas, which is our focus, make Douglas County a place that's important to all the citizens. And we certainly recognize that it's a complex process and that there are many areas where people's responsibilities overlap, but we feel that we can make a contribution to the process. So, thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any others who would like to speak? So at this point, we will close the public comment section of tonight's meeting and bring it up to the Planning Commission for discussion. That doesn't mean you're off the hook. We may still ask you questions or ask of either staff or the public for clarification. We've been taking notes while you've been speaking. So I should also note that other than those 2 of us that sat on the steering committee, this is also the first time for the members of this body to have a chance to discuss this document, and they will have some of their own issues and questions to go with that also.
Okay, so I'll kick off our conversation here. One respectful correction to Chairwoman Willie. I was not involved since the beginning, so don't blame me if you don't like anything. But we should take some time and appreciate Commissioner Rasmussen, who started on it, and Commissioner Britton, who did. They did great work. I took over for Commissioner Rasmussen and Commissioner Willie for Commissioner Britton. So I guess maybe in a way to frame our conversation a little bit, I want to encourage you, when I read a lot of nonfiction, and there's an introduction at the beginning of every nonfiction book. And sometimes you have a tendency to skip that part and get right to the chapter, because that's where it actually has the details and the specifics about how you can make your life better, right? Or whatever that is. Don't skip the introduction here. It is a crucial part and something I think we need to discuss. The steering committee talked about it a lot, about whether it is to provide very specific details regarding land use in Lawrence and Douglas County, or is it to rely upon whether it's advisory committees or things like the MPO or the governing bodies themselves to set code? You know, where do the details come? I'm not sure there's a right answer. We talked about both sides of this. We could decide all of those specific details and set clear expectations, as some of the community has recommended we do. We could do that. However, is that the best way, and is that the authority that we have to do that, right? When Horizon 2020 came about, Scott, where were we with an actual development code in 1998?
We were working under the 1966 code.
Okay, and then we totally revised in what, is it 2000?
2006.
2006. So our development code today looks different than it did when we wrote Horizon 2020. Is that fair to say, Scott?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, so I think one of the things is understanding how our documents have changed a little bit. And I just think that's something that we sort of need to talk about. I'm not sure it's fair to look at Horizon 2020 without understanding all the other things that are happening, the MPO documents for Transportation 2040. Those types of things didn't exist when we had Horizon 2020 created. In fact, Chapter 16 didn't come about, it wasn't in the first plan. I mean, you can go, it was many, many years later that Chapter 16 came on. And so understanding how that relates, I think is important to think about. So I think it's just a good discussion item for us to have about what our expectations of the plan is. For me, in thinking about it a little bit, I thought a little bit of it more like maybe the Constitution a little bit, that it provides a broad framework. So to pick something maybe a little bit controversial, it says you have the right to bear arms. How we do that is different documents. That's not actually in the Constitution. Does that make sense? I mean, that's how I'm trying to find it in my mind. I don't know that that's a good example, but I think it's something we should talk about. It's something the steering committee talked a lot about, and at some point we're going to have to be okay with that decision, because I can see competing values both ways. I can certainly see that we want every detail, as former Commissioner Von Auken said, we want every detail kind of clearly explained, and at the same time I can see that that can be challenging for us because we may not be the best ones to make that decision. That may be better decided by other governing bodies or by advisory committees or other organizations. So I just sort of share that as something, a thought that's crossed my mind. The other section that I really would encourage everybody to look at is the appendix and that action plan. And while I agree with some members of the public who have said they aren't specific enough and they aren't measurable enough, I would agree with that some of those aren't as measurable as I would like. I think it gives us a way moving forward that we may have some better measurables and we may have some better specifics, and that we could amend the plan based on that. So those are just some things to maybe get our conversation going here. Yeah.
Thank you.
One other thing, maybe. I'm not sure there's ever going to be enough community input. That's always a challenge, and I appreciate Mr. Carter's response there. We did go chapter by chapter in the steering commission. It began in April, and we did usually 2 chapters at a time for about a period of, I think, 3 meetings that we talked about chapter by chapter. We did get a lot of, I would say we got a lot of feedback from the community during that stage of it. Did we get enough? Certainly not. We continually, I think that's the reason that this process has taken 4.5 years. It may take another 4.5 years. But I would say that I think there was some fatigue on the part of the steering committee at that point of wanting to hand it over to the next body to kind of keep going with it. So in a way, I appreciate those comments, but I do want you to know that we did go chapter by chapter after we received the draft from the planning department.
I would dovetail with that a little bit, because I came onto the steering committee fairly late, but was there for that chapter by chapter review. And I asked that we, at least as a first pass, not tackle it that way with the public process, because I think some of these questions about what level of specificity, how does the plan work, some of those things, when I came into it with the steering committee, those things I really struggled to catch up on, because I'd look at this chapter, in a vacuum and miss some of the larger context pieces. So perhaps that discussion will still come that way at some point, but at least as a first pass, I wanted to look at things kind of holistically and gauge what kind of community interest and concerns we had, so that we can kind of gauge our work plan from there. In terms of the issue of how much detail, and certainly I spoke with a lot of environmental groups, and the overarching concern is, if the detail isn't here, where is it? And I feel like if we decide that it's not, that level of detail that we had in chapter 16 is not appropriate maybe for a comprehensive plan, the question is, where will it be and who's responsible for it? And I think if we can answer those questions, where as a community we can say we're not losing anything, that we're gaining some environmental protections, but we're not losing anything that we had under the old plan, I feel like that would give the community a little bit more, a level of comfort with how we're moving forward with this new format. In terms of recommendations to bring in large sections of verbiage from 16 into 6, I feel like that's probably not appropriate as far as trying to make a full document that is readable and is traceable with the same format from one chapter to another. But certainly we need to make sure that the protections that we want to see are reflected in the new plan.
Madam Chair, can I interject a little bit on this? Because it may help the commission and even maybe the public. Because we did approach the interweaving some of these issues throughout differently than we have with Horizon 20, I really encourage you to look at this appendix that Commissioner Kelly mentions. And you'll find, for example, if you turn to the page 102 in the document, this appendix is meant to do a couple of things for us. One is lay out, in many ways, action items, future action items that will be prioritized in a large degree by the Planning Commission and governing bodies. The other thing is to sort of give us a benchmark in a way that annually we can look at every one of these policy statements to get a benchmark on how successful the plan is over time. So it's meant to do those two things. I think the thing it's going to start off doing is put us to work on implementing some of these things. On page 102, even though a lot of these things are interwoven, it takes them by chapters. And so you'll see that the natural resources chapter, thank you, Jeff, even if you see it starts at 1.1 and 1.2 and 1.4, those are pulled from the first chapter. And you'll see that we've pulled everything to do with that natural resources category and topic. And natural resources, frankly, has got the largest list of policies to it once you kind of study it. So, yeah, this starts outlining how we go from policy and goal and aspiration in the comp plan to code, which is where it's most valuable to us. We have, from our perspective, and this isn't to argue or debate these issues, but just advising you of kind of ours and the steering committee's perspective as we went through this. From our perspective, we sifted through Horizon 2020 on all categories, on all topics. We really tried to sift out the topics and the policies that weren't directly helpful to the commission from a land use perspective. So there, and we found many of them that were more management of how a city or county operates its fleet or something. Policies that we never would look to when looking at development applications. And so that was part of what we did. But we think and we hope we maintain the very salient ones that are most helpful to the commission to judge development applications. And then we even enhanced it where it really matters, we think. And where it really matters from our perspective is, for example, increasing the applicability of sensitive lands codes, which isn't the code today. So for example, today, if you have sensitive lands on your property, it only gets applied to residential use. We think that should be expanded to any and all uses. As a policy, that makes a lot of sense, right? But as you go and debate that discussion in the community and we come up with code, that's a different day. That's kind of a battle for a different day. And that balance is a battle for a different day. But it's aspiring to treat the environment at a higher level than we do today. Floodplain regulations is another example where we have enhanced the policy to say we need to strengthen and enhance that idea of developing in the floodplain. And then that goes back into the appendix. It becomes perhaps something that rises to the level of a first or second year priority by which to put us to work to develop code on. An example that has frustrated many people, including us, for example, is developing stream corridor buffer regulations. We actually just got that initiated by the City Commission a couple of months ago, and we're working with our MSO department, and Matt Bond in particular, who has been the city's stormwater engineer, to bring that to the light of day. That came from Chapter 16, the Environment Chapter, many years ago now. So I would encourage you to spend some time with this appendix. It really is the punch list of items. It's all the ones that we think we need to act on to fulfill and implement this plan. So that's not to say we haven't hit the right mark and balance on the environment. We get that the environment is one of those topics that can go very, very far and can be pretty skimpy. And we're hoping to strike the right balance with it.
I'd like to say that from the aspect of what is the proper nature of specificity in the plan, to Commissioner Kelly's comment on, in the introduction, page 7, the comprehensive plan is the originating document for all other plans. So is it appropriate to have the finite level of specificity in there? I would say probably not. In the military, the highest plan that comes out is relatively short. Invade Normandy, drive the Nazis out of Germany. And then as the echelons go down, it gets more and more detailed. And the level of specificity for one lower echelon is much more appropriate than it is to line it out in the higher document. What I would like to see, and I don't know how we change this, if we change this, is in a couple sentences or a paragraph to explain out that concept, because it's on a little nice little infographic on page 7, but is that enough? I mean, the comprehensive plan drives the strategic plan. They're different in scope, both in time and space, and then the strategic plan informs the operating budget and then the management of the city specifically, and I think in this example, but we're probably not talking about the unincorporated areas of Douglas County because they don't have a strategic plan, or do they?
Well, it's symbolic of how that planning goes
Right.
from general to specific. So they would do the capital planning, their budget, very similar
Okay.
process, even though they don't
So
maybe
thi-
have what they call a strategic plan.
Okay, so this figure reflects mainly what the city does.
I think it's intended to be representing both governments.
Okay.
really just in terms of these things that cities and county governments do should all fall under these general policies of the
Right.
comprehensive plan.
So I'm okay with it not being as specific, although I do wholly appreciate the comments from everybody that says if it's not gonna be in detail here, and it's not in detail elsewhere, then where's it gonna be? It does need to be in detail elsewhere. I agree with the chairwoman that probably not this document, maybe another document. As far as, I guess I have a quick question for staff, as far as our purpose for this action item, what are we doing tonight?
So the way we talked about this, assuming that we'd get maybe a little more input, your role tonight was to identify issues that you think you need to grapple with to come to some resolution on making a recommendation. And actually, you're an approving body in this case. So for example, if you thought that we needed to go back to the Horizon 2020, Chapter 16, and look more closely, more deeply at, did we omit policies that should be here? Should there be a little more specific? What policies might we bring back from a land use lens to put back into the plan? You could put us to task on that. You could ask for more information about how much public input and all the points of public input. We can give you information on that to kind of just show you, not judging ourselves what it was, but just to show you how much public input there was. But I think we were forecasting issues that you would need to spend time with and get yourself educated on. And I'll be honest, I think I forecasted you would come here highly educated on this. We spent time with you. We had liaisons on the steering committee to bring you back that perspective. So maybe we assumed wrong about how much time you needed with the planning document. I think the environment, and I think that we are, it's been undersold a little bit, this idea that Mr. Carter brings to the table about growth management. We didn't hear a lot on growth management. I don't know why. This has been out there for a while. I think that is going to be something that, as it gets to other governing bodies, we'll hear maybe more about. But, so there's a couple topics there that I'm curious to know where you all stand on them. And so maybe the discussion should turn to, how comfortable are you with what came out of the steering committee? And do you see conflicts that we need to look at and that you need to look at? Because ultimately, this gets approved by the planning commission, not the staff, not the stakeholders. You're representing stakeholders and that kind of thing, but it's really the plan that you have to be comfortable with approving.
And with that, I think we can kind of bring it to and not so much focused at this point on just the section of the public that we've heard tonight, but what issues, as you all, or as we all have read through this document, what issues came to the forefront for you that you were either very comfortable with or felt like it needed some work or some clarity? So kind of putting everybody on the spot to say, what did you think of the document?
I'll start, since I like the document overall. I was taking a look at a couple other, I was trying to think of towns that are generally in our same size, but prior to coming here tonight, I looked at a couple of other comprehensive, I just Googled, one town that I could think of, comprehensive plan, until I found a handful, 3 or 4. It's really intense, really professional work that I know Jeff would be really proud of, a simple Google search, but as far as how it's written, it is, in my opinion, far better than the other examples I've seen. I've seen similar examples in layout, in length, but what I was really looking at is, given a comparison between what we had as Horizon 2020 and what this document is, how are other communities writing their comprehensive plans? And it is written in the goals, specificity level of having a topic with kind of overarching goals. And I get how that's scary, because it's, what it seems to me is that we operated on a comprehensive plan for a long time that had a lot of very specific things in there. It was easy to use as one reference for either applicants, well, applicants had to use more than one reference, but for the public. But this really is kind of going in line with generally what other communities are doing. So is that a good thing? Is it a bad thing? I mean, I'm fine with it. I'm fine with doing things that are kind of in that zeitgeist. And I think this document does it. I've got some specific comments on some specific goals, but I'm gonna hold on to those for a little bit. But overall, I think that Jeff and the steering committee got us to about an 85% solution on what we need for an originating document. An originating document. Something that informs and directs other plans. Luke, it's your turn.
We're just gonna go down rolling
Yeah,
boulder
we'll
here.
go that way.
So I'd offer one interpretation, correct, is that I appreciate the comments from the public, and especially the letters, because it gives me time to research. And one thing I noticed, as I did with some of the requests that were in there, used to be in chapter 16, but are now in the transportation section. And it sort of gave me pause to think a little bit, is, are we thinking in silos? And listening to Mr. Carter's statement tonight, it may do us well to get public input at looking at each individual chapter.
Sure.
Because, the public that commented, it was, I want to talk specifically to the environmental resources chapter, and not the plan on the whole. Mr. Carter's comment, I want to talk about the growth section, not the plan on the whole. An interpretation for why we don't have a lot of people here is that we just sort of put it out there as, we're going to talk about the whole plan. And a possible discussion is, maybe we do start going chapter by chapter. I mean, maybe we do for our own, to be good servants of our own thinking, to go chapter by chapter and say, look, I'm just doing these 8 pages. And I just share that out, that I think that's interesting that we're responding already chapter by chapter and not the whole document.
Yeah, I don't mind that thought at all. Take a couple, and then we could get through it in 3 months. I mean, we're not on a strict.
This was supposed to be done in 18 months.
I felt the laser eyes.
Commissioner Strong.
This is our plan.
So Commissioner Kelly, do you envision something, I'm just kicking around here, similar to the process that the steering committee went through with its meetings, chapter by chapter,
Well, and
but with a more public?
to answer your question directly, maybe. And maybe starting with those, I mean, don't discount the public input that came. Remember that high, medium, and low of each. It may be good to start with some of the higher categories, because I think sometimes if you do some of the higher categories, you're gonna, I don't know that this group has spent enough time yet to really understand the conflictual nature of some of the things that are in this document yet.
I've seen a couple already.
And maybe you're already there, but I think it sort of uncovers when we don't have such specificity, it's sometimes hard to see those conflicts, but they'll emerge.
We're not really opposed to that, Madam Chair. I mean, part of this is this commission has to work with this plan after it's approved. And you need to know, we hope you know it inside and out after you get done dissecting it, assessing it, hearing from the public. And it would take 3 months to get through it, I think, if we set aside a meeting each month and do, a third each time. I think some of them are going to be simpler than others, but it probably would take that long to get through it, if that's the way you go.
Well, and I think the hope is that this body does due diligence with the public, so that as it goes to then the city commission and county commission, that we don't have, as, we can eliminate as much kick back and forth as we can, so that, you know, if we do the bulk of our homework here, then, and not that there isn't still an opportunity for the public to then speak to those groups, they will and they should. But the hope is that we would have a way to find and get good public input on, you know, we did seem to manage to get good input on the environment chapter, but we still have a whole other document here that should be involving the community at a level that they're not yet. So we need to find out how to do that. And if going by chapter helps groups come out of the woodwork to inform us, then I think that is very valuable.
I interpret that we hit a home run, and it's perfect, and there's no input to be had.
Does anybody want to make a motion?
So, yeah, still in this first pass, though, I had hoped that we'd kind of identify some areas of concern that this group might have. And I have one that is fairly specific that I can throw out there, and that's the document doesn't mention home business specifically. I'd like to see that, and we can find a home for that if we get more specific, but and specifically that as an action item, the city commission and county commission or their staffs would look at specifically at the rules that govern home businesses to make sure that those are friendly and available and strike the balance that we want them to in the community. So that's just one item of something that I felt was missing from the plan. It's fairly straightforward. Are there other things like that that people have found that you care about?
So I have one in the second, and it came from feedback from the public today, and it's the second sentence of the introduction. I think we need to talk about what is policy and what is not policy. So the second sentence is about a framework for making future physical development and policy decisions. So is that creating policy, or is that based on this document, we'll be able to make policy? Does that make sense, folks? I understood in reading one of the letters this idea of this is the policy document. This doesn't feel like a policy document to me. It feels like a vision document. And so that word policy, I just want to talk about, I would encourage us to talk about what does that mean? Because policy should be very specific, and I don't think this document is very specific, and maybe it should be, and maybe it shouldn't be, but that's something that I want to talk about.
Okay.
One of my notes is this a legal document? What is the consequence if not followed? Policy has an enforcement arm to it, whether it's law or code or whatever. I don't know how we can necessarily, to your point, I don't know how we could enforce things that say encourage or support, identify. These aren't words that can be easily enforced. They're not action verbs.
Well,
They are, but they're
but if you go right under the authority section, it talks a little bit about the comprehensive plan is implemented by the Land Development Code. So it talks about that, planning and zoning. So I think when you talk about it's a binding land use document, you're referring back to and incorporating all the codes in that, correct?
So Lawrence is a little unique in the state in that our development code actually says that a project has to meet the comp plan or the plan needs to be amended. We were trying to strengthen that idea some of you have heard this argument with development projects that come out and say, hey, it's a guide in Kansas, the state legislature didn't say you have to abide by it. Well, our local laws do. That's how we interpret our local laws. And so we wanted to put that issue to rest once and for all and just say it right in the comp plan, that it's a binding document that needs to be adhered to. But you're right, because against Horizon 2020, which didn't have any sector plan able to serve it, we now have ringed the city with sector plans. So when we bring you a development project in the fringe area, you're usually looking at a color on a map saying, nope, you got to bring us a brown project, right, a residential project. Well, I want to bring you a red commercial project. Well, that's a comp plan amendment, and it's that specific sector plan. So in some ways, does it meet the comp plan? We're looking at the physical development. In other ways, the second way a comp plan works is it is the basis for code. And that's the policies we look to that get transformed and transferred into code. So it does a little bit of both. But when we talk about a binding document for development purposes, it's you need to meet the policies or the sector plan that you're developing in.
So to come back again to the environment, how does that work? Because we're not looking for falling under the comprehensive plan, that we have a sector plan that we go to. It's an overarching, what would be the documents that would cover the level of specificity that we're looking for environment? Are those documents yet to be written?
Some of them are, like the climate protection plan is something that this plan calls for. Kind of like our stream buffer plan, that hasn't been developed yet, so that's going to need to be developed. But we don't know which of the great bodies of the government might do that yet, because we just don't, we haven't made it part of our work plan. But I think that will influence a great deal some of our land development issues and codes. We have the sustainability division working through the STAR program, and that's informing us on some things. That informs building codes and different things like that, and incentive work and those kinds of things. So some of it we won't know, but essentially it's going to be the development code. It's going to be the joint subdivision regulations that carry out floodplains, sensitive land areas, those sorts of things. Some of them are more aspirational and maybe speak to things that we don't really control, and we've tried to stay away from things we don't control. We can talk an awful lot about agriculture, but agriculture has the highest protection of all. They're completely exempt from our regulations by state statute. And so, we can talk about how to make ag work better and such, but we don't have a lot of authority to do that. And you're not likely to ever see a project that has to do with how to terrace a farm or something, as an example, right? So does it belong in our comp plan? Maybe. If it's an aspirational statement, it might, because those things are important overall. But are we trying to make this a document to apply to development projects, both rural and urban, or are we trying to do more than that? That's a question that we need to ask ourselves as we look at the details of the policy.
Can I just piggyback on Chairwoman's question? The Chapter 16 of Horizon 2020 came into play later than 98, I think you mentioned, Commissioner Kelly. Was it adopted before the 2006?
It was after.
Okay,
It was
so.
after.
2011.
Okay, so much after. So what I was trying to figure out during the course of our conversations is if we could assume that sort of the policies and goals of Chapter 16 had been implemented in the code, because we're going to need to change the code then, over the course of time to sort of affect the goals and policies we have from an environmental or resource perspective.
So I'll get two examples. One is, that stream buffer ordinance finally got kicked off because we finally had some time to work on it. Another example is the links development. There was an example that they provided more protection of their wooded areas than the code said they had to. And for that, we had a discussion about the housing product they wanted to cluster up on that property. And so we pointed to some of those values to get that project through the process, because they were upholding some of those values for us. So it has been used in that way. It didn't have that support before the environment chapter necessarily.
So, to me, it seems like the entire structure of the plan is very different from what we were dealing with Horizon 2020. And even with the specificity of Horizon 2020, it took 8 years from the implementation of the plan to the rewriting of the development code. I wonder if, I'm not sure if this is directed to Scott and Jeff or to members of the the subcommittee, what is the vision for implementation? We've got these steps which are stated to, could be taken up as the governing bodies see fit. But could you walk us through a scenario? It doesn't have to be a specific scenario, but a scenario of how, for example, an element of the existing code could now be seen to be in conflict with provisions of the plan, and how that would get updated so that the public would actually see that implemented.
I'll give you an example while Jeff thinks. He's probably got one right off the top of his head. But so, for example, we want to integrate more neighborhood commercial into neighborhoods that will form as Lawrence grows. But when you look at the West of K-10 plan, we've completely separated them out and put them on the arterial intersections, right? So that's one thing, we might have to go into that West of K-10 plan, open it up formally, invite the property owners that might get affected to the room, and talk about policies that integrate and give us the support to do smaller neighborhood nodes of commercial interspersed into residential areas. That's one example. The other conflicts, I think, are that it's probably not going, the regulation isn't going far enough. So floodplain, for example, there's a little bit of conflict now where we talk about preserving and protecting floodplain. We even in our sector plans kind of paint floodplain green to say it's preserved, but our codes actually allow development in the floodplain. So there's a little bit of conflict now. We're hoping to close that gap on those conflicts.
So I guess a question I would have is, if a developer or landowner makes a proposal that conforms to the existing code but conflicts with elements of the new plan, how do we see that dealt with by staff, and then how would that come before us in terms of a recommendation, a determination?
That's a good question. So the code is what we use in development proposals because that's the law, right? So this is going to, once approved, we need to kind of immediately get in there and pull out the big pieces to implement in our codes. And that's where we're going to seek help from you and the City County Commission. If there are those conflicts that we can identify, we may have a development that meets code in conflict of the comp plan policy until we can make it a priority to change that code and align those policies up. So, it may be a little messy for a couple of years while we get those things completely aligned.
So we may see a lot of following this idea of, a governing document, we may see a lot of our discussions over the next couple of years could involve these highlights where this is technically allowed by code, but in conflict with the intent of the plan.
I don't think you're going to find a lot of those issues in my mind. I really don't. I think what you're going to find is maybe conflicts in the sector plans and what the plan says, because all of our sector plans have been built off the Horizon 2020 policies. Now we may have to get in and tweak some of those sector plans to align better with Plan 2040. So
I think the sector plans are really going to be kind of that stepping stone, really making some of these things come down to that smaller level, because they look and act and feel like Horizon 2020. They don't look and act and feel like Plan 2040 wants to go to. So really looking at them and really opening them up is probably going to be a critical first step to really start bringing it down to that code level.
Well, Jeff, I think you said we have like 80% of the growth area not covered by a sector plan yet. You anticipate any areas that we're going to have to get sector plans up and running for?
Well, when we did the calculations and looked at it, we had enough land covered in a sector plan to carry us through to 2097. So we should be okay in that department for quite a bit of time. It's really a matter of, I think, addressing
the amounts of things. So do we have enough industrial? Do we have enough large lot industrial? Do we have enough civic? Probably some of those uses more than residential and commercial. And then just addressing where we really find it best to put the resources at. That might be north or south or east or west. It could just depend on the moment there, but the urban growth area is not covered by a large swath of the sector plans, but the sector plans have a lot of capacity built into them right now.
I like the way you spoke of the sector plans as being more like what we think of code now, where they read more like Horizon 2020 instead of 2040. And I would hope that that would give some comfort to people, including me, who are worried a little bit about the specificity of the language in the new comprehensive plan. And going back to Chair Willie's statement or question really at the beginning, if that language is in our Horizon 2020 and it's not in 2040, where is it? That I think is going to be the key. We still need that language, and as we know, we will need, I want to say more restrictive language, but as we realize that things like environment, water protection, floodplain, affordable housing become more important, we add these things into our planning documents. And so I think we certainly do not want to remove things that give us guidance, that give us institutional memory, that tell us the intent of our previous commissions in formulating these documents, including 2020. And so I take comfort in the idea that that language will be found, and it's going to be necessary, I think you're right, to go and open those documents and re-examine them and perhaps include that language. And in some cases, it's going to be incumbent on us, on the public, to what do you feel is missing? If we ask that question and take that input, then it's my hope that we'll be able to say those questions, those solutions are found now in our sector plan for that, for instance, in the sector plan. If that specific language is not in our comprehensive plan, then we'll go down plan, and by reference, as we say now, we include these documents. That language needs to be in there. That's my feeling on a general level. And obviously, the Planning Commission went back and forth and had long discussions about the specificity of the language in 2040. And so I think that can be remedied by including it in those other documents. The question is, is there a lag time there after 2040 is adopted? Do we identify those small issues, open those documents for these minor, be they minor or major, one at a time? Do we go through a 2 or 4 year period of reinspection of these documents to update them? Or do we allow our perceived need to include this language to govern the timing of those? That's just kind of I see these sector plans, some of which are very nebulous and kind of, undeveloped, as the repository for some of that specific language if it's not in this document. Because I think it still needs to be there for the most part. We are, as I say, we are realizing the need to address more and more issues, the ones I just named, for instance. And so I would hope that those protections, those ideas, those solutions remain in the language, and perhaps that's where those words will be, is in our sector plans, not in the comprehensive plan.
So give me a second here. If everyone will indulge me and turn to page 98 in your planning, in your comprehensive plan. And then flip all the way, hold that page there, and go all the way to page 108. If we want specificity, we're going to have to make decisions on every one of these items. That's what really came to bear for me as we sat there in the subcommittee, was looking at all of these items. So just looking at page 108, encourage, this top one, encourage combining and creating multiple use facilities when appropriate, such as schools, community centers, fire, police station, to improve accessibility and efficiency. That is a huge, huge aspirational goal, that if we want specificity on that item and how we're going to measure it, by 2040, we may be done with this document. Right? I mean, and that's really the challenge for us, is we as human beings want specificity until we have to decide what that specifically is. Right? Because that means we're making value judgments, and those are hard to do. I think of this sort of as a strategic plan, as an aspirational plan for our community. Drilling down to all of those different specific items is going to take a lot of discussions and a lot of hard decisions. I'm not sure we're going to be able to get there in time to approve it. I mean, that's just my opinion, and that was hard to overcome because I want that specificity. I want those measurable things that we talk about. But quite honestly, I'm not sure we have time to get to all of them. And by the time we do, we're going to have new ones that we haven't even thought of. I mean, Jeff referenced fiber optic. You know, we have to, remember, it is a flexible document. It took me many years on the Planning Commission to understand that the comprehensive plan is a flexible document. It is not code. It is not, and even code isn't set in stone. You know, we make code amendments all the time. So I think it is our predilection to want something exact, and this is what it is, but I think that is a dangerous place to go.
So my understanding is this implementation chapter, which, you know, goes from page 98 to page 108, that's our homework. That's what we're tasked with for the next 20 years, is to choose.
Both the benchmarking and some homework to work on some.
But we get to decide a work plan. I mean, we as this body get to say, these 3 topics, that's what we want to tackle this year. We want to start, you know, getting some specific language on those things and working it into the code, into a specific plan, whatever is needed. That's my understanding, is that this is kind of a
It may not be
starting
you,
point.
because, I mean, I think one thing Commissioner Sands brought up is the new comp plans, the cities didn't have all of these things to grapple with 30 years ago when we did comp plans, right? We laid out land use, we laid out street grids, there's your comp plan. Now we have cultural arts, we have food policy, we have sustainability, we have, did I say arts and culture? We have multimodal issues. And we've got boards and commissions and task force and divisions working on all of these all of the time. And so one of the things this does that's so much different than Horizon 2020 is say, let's not replace all those people and all those topics and everything else and cram it into a 1,000-page document that's going to be hard to digest. Let's let those people provide, and the plans that come out of the groups, let's incorporate them by reference so that we have them at our disposal for the land use part of those things, not everything, right? Not the operational part. We'll let the county government decide what they want to fill their gas tanks on their fleets with, you know? But let's let whatever part of a food policy statement come out and inform us on a new food hub, for example, as a value. So instead of having all that specificity in the comp plan, we're saying, yeah, there's a group that's working on this issue. Let's not reinvent it or work on it differently than what they're doing, because we've seen that too, right? We want to tackle it one way, and we have others tackling it a different way, and we sort of want to let those experts do their work and then lean on their work when it comes to doing land use and development guidance. Does that make sense for what we're trying to accomplish here anyway? But it's a balance, so we've got to balance those things.
It's a
Go ahead.
replace, not a rewrite. We're replacing a plan that was not really a comprehensive plan.
It's really expanding it to all of these new topics. One of the things we did with the issue action report, that was the value of that, is to say, what's missing from Horizon 2020? That was one of the key things, and that's why you see that colored document assigning low, medium, and high priority. Some of the things like, like I applaud the chamber in their strategic plan around economic development. We're on the right track with that. We're getting some projects in the ground, that sort of thing. That was addressed in a very high level in Horizon 2020, and we think we carried those things over to Plan 2040. We didn't need to spend a whole lot of time on that in creating policies because we already had them to borrow. But so much of it was new for us. Local food systems, right? Arts and culture, Parks and Rec was doing a new master plan. Utilities had done a new master plan in the last decade. So a lot of these things we needed to spend our time on and show up as new projects, new products that frankly need more work to go. We're not quite there yet. So, but if we took the time to put the work in it now, we wouldn't get to a new plan. We just wouldn't. So I do agree with that part of the discussion.
I think it's also, Horizon 2020 gave us an excellent foundation to get started with. We didn't really want to take the whole thing completely apart to build back the same house. We wanted to take all that good work we had and just progress it forward again. Because it was a great document that carried us a long way in pretty good shape. It had some missing pieces, but I think we got those fixed.
Commissioner Carter.
One of my first observations is I think that the whole architecture of the plan is very different from Horizon 2020. With Horizon 2020, we had these strategies, goals, and policies. So you're kind of on each thing, you're kind of drilling down to very specific actions. Here, it is more like kind of a vision, but then this appendix with the implementation tells you sort of which areas of public policy are these going to affect. It may be development code, it may be something else. I find that actually really exciting. I think one of the reasons I was a little disoriented arriving at this discussion was I was thinking of this purely in terms of the change in the content. In what ways is the plan different? But I think it helps to take a step back and say, in what ways is the treatment of planning different in this document versus Horizon 2020? So going back to Jeff's presentation, and we've seen it twice now in a way, I think what would help me and may actually help the public a little bit is some description of the way in which this plan is different from Horizon 2020, not just in terms of what it says, but in terms of how it says it, and also in terms of how it is intended to be used. So going to that appendix, I find it super helpful. I can see going back to this, not just as a commissioner, but just as a member of the public in the future, saying, okay, how are we doing? How are we doing on each of these things? There's actually a status bar that says, has anything been done on this? And I imagine over time, and the genius of this digital presentation of the plan as opposed to a printed document, is you can go in and say, oh, there's a link here to whatever that policy document is that's been developed to address this issue. I think one thing that could help, getting back to Scott's answer to Commissioner Sand's question, what are we doing here? What can we ask staff to do? And this may be a big ask, but it would be helpful to know in which ways distinct elements of this plan do conflict or are distinct from what Horizon 2020 was prescribing. So if we were to take the new plan 5 years from now, 2 years from now, and look back at specific elements of Horizon 2020, what will have changed? Because I think in helping us as commissioners and the public in general navigate this change, it would be, all credit to members of the public who will go and read both documents thoroughly. Most people will want to know, how does this particular area of my interest get treated differently? And I think it would be helpful to have that index, that cross-index, and the plan update guide does a great job of mapping sections to sections, but we don't have as clear a guide of policies to policies or strategies to visions. Am I making sense?
That's a lot of wow. I can't imagine how much time that would take. I opened my mail and I was super excited.
Me too.
That A, it was in color, and B, it was not very many pages. So I do understand what Penny was saying as far as the specificity. I do think that this is a lot easier to read. I'm more apt to pick this up than I am to even think about Horizon 2020. I don't want to think about it. I would rather think about this. I think Jeff and I think everyone did a great job. I do understand some people need more information, and I just think that's a huge task that, you know, you're inquiring whether staff can do it or not. I do think that there's a way to tie in a lot of questions, or I know Penny was concerned about the shrinking down of the chapter to, I think you said like 4.5 pages. And there's got to be some way to get that information, maybe by clicking on a link or something. I just don't think that having super specific details is the way to go when we're trying to get people to participate and to ask questions and want to participate. But I do think what Commissioner Kelly said was correct. And I think that, you know, specificity adds thousands of pages to something I think is a great document. And it's just going to force people to go utilize, click on different parts of the development code, click on different parts of other codes or documents, policies, and read those. So I just can't imagine having a big expansive document that, I mean, we already don't have, you know, half a room full of people here today. So if we make it bigger, I can't imagine very much more participation.
And I want to be clear, I'm not suggesting that the plan itself be amended with huge volumes of additional material. I guess my point is around the update guide itself, or something that helps us map the old document to the new document. So, and I guess I'm complimenting staff on this update guide. It's really brilliant in helping us see what's different, right? I guess what I'm asking for is whether it's a reasonable ask, and not necessarily on a, you know, code by code basis, but overall, what's changing? What's changing by section?
So I think we're asking for a little bit more information for next meeting, not for right now, to maybe help us, again, and the public to walk through some of those kind of big ticket item changes. And I'm aware of some of those from the work of it, but we may be able to ferret out a few others also. I also want to honor the time of the people who came out here to speak about and about the growth and development and about the environment chapters. It sounds like this body will want to tackle things chapter by chapter, because the level of detail, and not only of the people that spoke, but also in the written communications, we want to be able to honor that. And there's a lot of things that we're not going to be able to talk about at the appropriate level at this point if we're planning to go chapter by chapter in the future. So I just want to make sure that we're not ignoring any of that. There's some really great specific language suggestions and things like that that I want to spend time with, but it sounds like we will do that as we go through each chapter. So for the rest of tonight's meeting, I think perhaps we can maybe wind down a little bit for tonight and make our work plan that we would tackle, say, the introduction and the first chapter in a meeting, and then 2 chapters a meeting after that. Is that an appropriate pace?
Yeah, I was going to suggest that, Madam Chair, and also suggest that you direct us to start a little bit of comparison of Horizon 2020 environment policies to what's in P2040, to see what may be missing in the balance of things, to bring that, once we get to our Chapter 6 of P2040 natural resources, we can bring that information to you. You can then discuss whether that is information helpful to this document. But yeah, starting off with 1, 2, maybe in December, maybe it's even 3, 4, and 5 in, are we doing one night? January and February have holidays, I think, right? We have to tackle that issue, I think. But whatever the calendar might hold, even if we put it on a regular action night, I mean, I think if we do take it apart in smaller bites, it's gonna be easier, less timely. We've only spent, a couple hours on it tonight, so that, I think we could do it that way.
Well, and I would recommend that we don't necessarily have to keep the chapters in order, that because of the level of interest that we've had from the community, that we put the environment chapter in that first meeting. So maybe we do the introduction in the environment chapter.
I wouldn't, if we're gonna compare and contrast, we can't
need
do
more
that by
time.
December.
Okay.
I think you've got enough on your plate to do mission, vision, and growth in one meeting, and then that environment maybe could be part of the second meeting, but that's my recommendation to you.
I'd just like
Commissioner
to
Carter.
speak to the change between Chapter 16 and Chapter 6, since that's the one that we had the most input on. I mean, I don't know what time frame we're looking at, that came up, but the time frame for Horizon 2020 was expansive. I mean, and it was first adopted by this commission in May of '96, the city commission of January of '97, and the county commission not until 2 years later, after the planning commission. And then from that date until Chapter 16 came in was 13 years from the initial adoption by the planning commission. I mean, it took 13 years to get to that. And that was just in 2011, so we've got 7 years, which is after the development code, to try to implement the current Chapter 16 into the development code. So what I'm hearing, it's kind of tonight, and my kind of concern is in this carryover between the two plans, I don't want to drop out or miss or let things disappear that are of value to the community as expressed in Horizon 2020. I mean, one is just the urban forest that's in Chapter 16. I mean, the first presentation I remember about that was in year 2000 to the city commission about we need to have something about urban forest. It finally made it into the code in 2011, and it's still not implemented. We have, significant lands and trees and such, but that's a different animal than urban forest. So, there are things, I don't want to see them fall through the cracks. So it'd be helpful in putting together for the Chapter 6, just where are we in those visions in Horizon 2020, which have been implemented, which are in process, and which haven't we touched yet? And we might want to add them as subpoints in maybe some of the action items in the last under climate change, because, urban forests can go under climate change if we haven't touched it yet. I mean, those types of things would be helpful in the discussion.
And I would add which show up in the P2042.
Yes,
so-
which are specifically in here,
Which aren't. So we
which
can
aren't, and which
give you that report.
which still need to be an action item so we don't lose sight of them.
I just wanted to clarify my earlier remarks to Commissioner Kelly. I wasn't proposing that we put that specific language in this document. I was confirming and hoping that that language would reside elsewhere, that we should not go back here.
It may not.
I understand that. I understand that. But, no, I think for the most part, I'm comfortable with the more visionary approach that this takes. But I say, as long as those important words can be found in our code elsewhere. And that's going to take some vigilance and work and like the rest of this, so.
It no longer seems to just be a land use plan. It's actually a vision for the entire community and county. So we are kind of tasking everybody in all their various roles to contribute to the overall welfare that we've identified as our aspirations in this plan.
So are we comfortable tabling this discussion for now until the December 17th meeting? And we will move forward with some smaller portion of it?
Yeah, I think that introduction and growth and management would be plenty for that night to both get yourselves educated to the fullest extent, hear from the public, and bat around some discussion.
All right. Well, do we need a motion to,
No, we'll just take that direction, and that'll
Okay.
be our first, our second meeting of the comprehensive plan.
does
Not that I'm keeping
anyone
tabs.
else have anything to add?
I like the general nature of the plan itself. I'm comfortable with that, and I once went to a training with a huge fire department, and their rules and regulations were "be nice." One page, those two words. And then they had standard operating procedures that would make everything happen. So, you know, I like the simple nature of it. One thing I don't like is all the individual plans at the back of the book. Some of them have action steps and all those kind of things included in them. It seems to me they should have a more consistent format so that you can compare those and you can say, okay, I want to go look at what your action steps are for aging in place or whatever it might be. I don't know how much control we have over those agencies or organizations that are putting those together, but it would be easier to find things, I think, if they were more consistent.
Yeah, that may be difficult. We can look at it. You know, the Affordable Housing Advisory Board is one of those boards that this group is going to be connected to in a pretty high level. But they're doing a lot of stuff that you're not necessarily involved in the weeds on. But the plan says they, you know, lean on them for some of those policies and help them implement the strategies that they can recommend to the city commission, for example. So those are, and that's on us, you know, that's on staff to make those connections and help you see those connections to food policy or sustainability or Heritage Council, you know, those kinds of things to say, look, the plan is bringing this group in, let's listen to what their values are and let's help them achieve some of those things.
All right, we have one other miscellaneous item on our agenda, which is just our.
We actually booted that to Wednesday, I think, right? Yeah.
Move the miscellaneous item?
Yes.
Excellent. Then I want to thank everyone for coming out. Spread the word that we still need more community input on all aspects of the plan. Talk about it in the community and get us more input. So, but thank you very much. And we did not get to the level of detail that you wanted to on the topics you came to talk about. But I hope that you will let the words that you gave us this time inform us, and the written communication that came in also, and also feel free to come back. So, do we have a motion to adjourn?
Recess
To recess.
until Wednesday.
Right. How about you make that motion?
Move that we recess the meeting until Wednesday, November 24th at 6:30 PM.
24th or 14th?
I mean, 14th, sorry. I want to go.
Futurist.
Should we just put on things, yeah.
14th.
Is that a second?
Yeah, second.
All in favor?
Aye.
10. Oh.